It is dawn on a cold, grey morning in May 1945. The war in Europe is over on paper, but for millions of German soldiers, the future is a blank page filled with fear. On a muddy field near the Rhine, a 22-year-old infantryman, Hans Müller, stands with his hands raised. His uniform is caked with dirt, his boots are torn, and he has not eaten a real meal in days. Around him, hundreds of other German soldiers are doing the same thing, dropping rifles, helmets, and the last pieces of a broken army. In front of them stand American geese, rifles leveled, helmets low, nervous fingers on triggers. They have fought through Normandy, the Bulge, and the final push into Germany. They have seen death, destruction, and the crimes of the Nazi regime. Now they face a new question. What do you do with an enemy who has stopped shooting? Hans is not a fanatical Nazi. He's a scared young man from a Bavarian village who was drafted into a war he did not start and could not control. He has been told his whole life that if he falls into Allied hands, he will be beaten, tortured, maybe even killed. That the Americans are brutal and vengeful. But as he's marched toward a makeshift barbed wire enclosure on the banks of the Rhine, reality looks different from the propaganda posters. The camp is crude. There are no barracks, only open ground surrounded by wire. The mud is deep, the spring wind is bitter, and there are far more prisoners than tents. But the men guarding them are not monsters. They are tired, hungry, and cold too. And above all, they are under orders. In the final months of the war, more than 3 million German soldiers laid down their arms on the Western Front alone. The Allied armies, American, British, French, and others, suddenly found themselves responsible for an entire defeated army. They had to feed them, guard them, house them, and decide what would happen to them next. In this film, you will follow the journey of men like Hans, from chaotic surrender fields in Germany, through temporary camps on the Rhine, across the Atlantic to the United States, into farms and factories, and finally back home to a shattered country. You will see both the best and the worst of Allied captivity, humane treatment under the Geneva Convention, but also overcrowding, hunger, and moments of revenge and injustice. You will discover how these German prisoners of war were used as laborers, students, and, in some cases, future citizens. And you will see how their time behind Allied barbed wire helped shape the post-war world. This is the story of German POWs in Allied camps. What really happened after the guns fell silent. By the spring of 1945, the German front in the West had completely collapsed. Entire divisions were surrendering at once. Columns of soldiers marched toward Allied lines, carrying white flags made from bedsheets and towels. Officers no longer talked about counterattacks, they talked about survival. The Allied High Command had planned for prisoners of war, but they had not planned for these numbers. Instead of tens of thousands, they now had to deal with millions. Rivers of human beings flowed into hastily created enclosures, open fields surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by exhausted GEs and British Tommies. Along the Rhine, on the western bank, large temporary camps sprang up almost overnight. Some were nothing more than fenced-off farmland. Prisoners slept under the open sky or under scraps of canvas. Food and clean water were in short supply, not because of deliberate cruelty, but because the Allied supply system was already stretched to the limit, feeding their own troops and the starving civilian populations of liberated Europe. In these early months, conditions could be brutally harsh. Rations were often below what the Geneva Convention prescribed. There were not enough latrines, not enough medical staff, and not enough time to build proper housing. Men like Hart stood in endless lines for soup that was more water than food. They dug drainage ditches, latrines, and makeshift shelters with their bare hands. At the same time, the Allies were trying to figure out a legal and moral problem. The Geneva Convention spoke clearly about prisoners of war in a normal conflict. But what do you do with millions of soldiers from a regime responsible for mass murder, extermination camps, and a global war? Should they be treated like any other POWs? Or were they something different? For a while, some German prisoners in the West were classified not as classic prisoners of war, but as disarmed enemy forces. It was a legal trick that allowed the Allies more flexibility in rationing and camp management. Later, most of these men would fall back under standard POW rules. But the transition was neither quick nor smooth. In the middle of all this, the average prisoner had no idea what legal category he belonged to. He did not see definitions in orders and memos. He saw whether there was bread in the pot, whether the guards beat people, whether the sick were treated or left to die. And in Western Allied camps, despite numerous shortages and early failures, there was a basic line that was rarely crossed. Prisoners were not to be massacred, tortured as a policy, or simply abandoned. This chaotic first phase set the tone for everything that followed. It showed the limits of Allied capacity and the limits of Allied mercy. For many German POWs, the next step was unexpected. After weeks or months in makeshift camps in France, Belgium, or along the Rhine, they were marched to ports and loaded onto ships. Not to return home, but to cross the Atlantic. The United States needed labor. American farmers and factories were short of workers because millions of American men were overseas or recently demobilized. At the same time, the US government did not want to flood war-torn European economies with millions of idle German soldiers all at once. The solution was simple and pragmatic: ship hundreds of thousands of German POWs to camps inside the United States, use them as labor under controlled conditions, and then send them home later. For men like Hart, the first glimpse of New York Harbor felt surreal. They had grown up on Nazi newsreels that showed America as a land of chaos, crime, and racial decay. Now they saw towering skyscrapers, bustling docks, and an industrial machine that had clearly outproduced the Third Reich many times over. The camps in the United States were very different from the muddy enclosures on the Rhine. Most were built on old training grounds, fairgrounds, or unused land. Prisoners were housed in wooden barracks with bunks, stoves, and basic bedding. The climate could still be harsh: scorching summers in Texas, freezing winters in the Midwest. But, compared to the front, many POWs felt they had landed in a strange kind of safety. Daily life in an American POW camp followed a strict routine. Reveille in the early morning, roll call in the yard, breakfast in a mess hall, often more substantial than what German civilians were eating back home. Then came work details: picking cotton in the south, harvesting potatoes in the Midwest, cutting lumber, repairing roads, or helping in canneries and factories. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs could be required to work, as long as the labor was not dangerous, humiliating, or directly connected to war production. In practice, Americans used German POWs to fill the gaps in agriculture and basic infrastructure. Prisoners were paid a small wage, not directly in cash they could take home, but as camp credits used to buy cigarettes, extra food, or small comforts in camp canteens. Many American civilians were shocked to see German uniforms in their towns. At first, anger and suspicion were common. Relatives of dead US soldiers did not want to see their enemies well fed and apparently safe. But over time, In many places, something else happened: contact. On farms, American families and German POWs worked side by side under the watch of a few guards. People exchanged words, then jokes, then small gifts. A cup of coffee, a piece of pie, a photograph of children back home. Some farmers came to see the prisoners not as faceless Nazis, but as young men who looked and sounded not so different from their own sons. For Hans, working on an American farm, the shock was cultural as much as political. There were no bomb craters here. Shops were full. Children played openly. He could not ignore the simple truth. The country he had been told to hate had defeated his homeland, not just with tanks and planes, but with a level of wealth and stability that the Third Reich could never match. Behind the barbed wire, the image of America that Nazi propaganda had built up began to crumble. Life inside Allied POW camps was a mixture of discipline, boredom, and tension. The guard's job was to prevent escapes, maintain order, and follow the rules passed down from above. For the prisoners, the main struggle was to preserve dignity and sanity in a world where every aspect of daily life was controlled. In many Western camps, German officers still held significant authority over their men. They organized roll calls, assigned responsibilities inside the camp, enforced discipline, and maintained a version of military order. This structure made it easier for Allied guards to manage large groups with relatively few personnel, but it also meant that Nazi influence did not simply disappear when the war ended. Within the wire, political divides among the prisoners quickly emerged. Hardcore Nazis formed cliques, wore improvised insignia, and tried to keep up ideological pressure. They threatened or attacked fellow prisoners who criticized Hitler or showed any sympathy toward the Allies. In some camps, there were beatings and even murders carried out by fanatical prisoners against those they saw as traitors. The Allies responded by screening prisoners, identifying committed Nazis, and isolating them in separate compounds. In American and British camps, special sections were set up for SS men, Gestapo members, and ideological hardliners. Here, the atmosphere could be much more tense, with frequent searches, interrogations, and stricter control. For the majority of POWs, however, life was dominated less by ideology and more by routine. They read whatever books were available. They organized theater groups, orchestras, sports leagues, and language classes. They built small gardens between barracks and crafted carvings, paintings, and handmade souvenirs. Sunday church services and small religious groups provided spiritual relief for some. Conflicts still flared, fights broke out over food, unfair treatment, or political arguments. Some guards abused their power, others treated prisoners with fairness and even kindness. The experience could differ sharply from camp to camp, and even from barrack to barrack, but across much of the Western Allied system, one line remained visible. There was an attempt, however imperfect, to recognize that these were prisoners, not targets. They had lost the war. They had to answer morally and historically for the regime they had served. Yet most would not be judged as individual war criminals. They were to be held, used for labor, and eventually sent home. For Hartz, this meant that his world shrank to a few fences, a guard tower, a barrack, and a series of repetitive days. Yet inside that small space, his picture of the wider world was changing. Through conversations with guards, through books and newspapers, and through small acts of fairness or cruelty, he slowly built a new understanding of his former enemies, and of his own country. Not all German POWs ended up in the United States. Hundreds of thousands were held in Great Britain and France, and their experiences there followed different patterns, shaped by each country's trauma and needs. In Britain, German POWs were brought into a country that had endured years of bombing, rationing, and loss. Many British civilians had lost homes or loved ones to the Blitz. Seeing German uniforms on British soil triggered powerful emotions. Yet the British government recognized that these prisoners were also a valuable resource in rebuilding a battered nation. POW camps in the UK were often set up in rural areas, on former airfields, in old military barracks, or on estates taken over for the war effort. Prisoners worked on farms, helped repair infrastructure, and cleared war debris. Like in the United States, daily life combined controlled routine with gradually increasing contact with the local population. Over time, British attitudes softened. Local churches invited POWs to services. Civilians sometimes brought gifts at Christmas. A number of German prisoners eventually married British women and stayed after the war, becoming part of the fabric of post-war British society. In France, the atmosphere was different. France had been occupied by Germany 4 years. Its cities and villages had experienced repression, executions, and deportations. French citizens had endured humiliation and hunger under German boots. When the war ended, there was a deep desire for justice and, in some cases, for revenge. French authorities used German POWs extensively as forced labor for reconstruction. They cleared mines, repaired roads, rebuilt railways, and worked in agriculture and industry. Conditions in some French camps were tough, especially in the immediate aftermath of the war, when food shortages and housing problems affected everyone. For many German prisoners, the French camps were among the hardest experiences outside the Eastern Front. They were watched by guards who had once been prisoners themselves, or who had seen their families suffer under occupation. Yet even there, over time, personal relationships sometimes developed. Farmers who depended on POW labor came to value reliable workers. Some former enemies even formed long-term bonds. Hans, in our story, never goes to France. But tens of thousands of men in his position did. Their memories reveal a side of Allied captivity that could be far more bitter than the relative comfort of some American or British camps. They remind us that the Allies were not one single bloc, and that their policies toward German prisoners reflected very different national experiences of the war. By late 1945 and into 1946, the war was over, but the struggle over what would replace Nazism had only just begun. The Allies understood that millions of returning soldiers would shape Germany's future. They would vote, raise children, staff offices, and rebuild institutions. What they believed about democracy, guilt, and justice would matter for decades. In Western POW camps, this led to a wave of educational and re-education efforts. These programs were not identical everywhere, and they were often clumsy or uneven. But across the United States, Britain, and parts of Western Europe, prisoners were given access to books, newspapers, lectures, and documentaries that challenged the worldview they had grown up with. In many camps, German POWs were shown films about concentration camps and the crimes of the Nazi regime. For some, this was the first time they saw images from places like Buchenwald and Dachau. Reactions varied. Some were shocked and horrified. Some refused to believe it. Others admitted that, deep down, they had always suspected something, but had chosen not to look. Classrooms appeared inside barbed wire. Teachers, both Allied and German, explained the basics of parliamentary democracy, freedom of speech, and the rule of law. Discussion groups debated what had gone wrong in Germany. Prison newspapers, often edited by moderate or anti-Nazi POWs, published articles criticizing the old regime and exploring new political ideas. Not all prisoners were willing to engage. Hardcore Nazis dismissed the programs as propaganda. Others were simply exhausted and focused only on going home. But a significant number of men took these opportunities seriously. They learned English, studied history, and reconsidered what they had been told in Hitler youth meetings and party rallies. For Hartz, sitting in a makeshift classroom in an American camp barrack, this was a turning point. He had joined the army out of duty and fear, not ideology. Now, with the guns silent and the Reich in ruins, he had time to think. The images of camps and corpses could not easily be dismissed, nor could the relative fairness with which he, as a defeated enemy, was being treated. Re-education was not a magic switch. It did not instantly transform everyone into convinced Democrats, but it planted seeds. When these men returned to a divided Germany, to the emerging Federal Republic in the West or to the Communist East, those seeds influenced how they reacted to new political systems. In a way, the battle for the minds of German POWs was one of the first campaigns of the Cold War, and it took place not in front of tanks, but in barracks, classrooms, and makeshift cinemas inside POW camps. For every prisoner, one question overshadowed all others. When will I be allowed to go home? The answer depended on who held you, what you had done during the war, and how urgently your labor was needed. The process of repatriation, sending prisoners back to Germany, was slow, bureaucratic, and often deeply emotional. In the United States, large-scale repatriation began as the war in Europe ended and continued into 1946. Transports brought men from camps in the American interior to East Coast ports. From there, ships carried them back across the Atlantic to Britain or directly to German ports, where they passed through reception and screening centers. Some prisoners stepped onto German soil expecting to find their old lives waiting for them. Instead, they found ruins. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden had been bombed into rubble. Food was scarce, families were displaced or missing. The Reich they had fought for no longer existed. In its place stood occupation zones, foreign soldiers, new flags, and a political order that was still being negotiated. In Britain and France, repatriation often took longer. Both countries relied heavily on POW labor to rebuild. In France especially, the state was reluctant to release the last German prisoners until the late 1940s. This created bitterness among some POWs, who felt they were paying for crimes committed by others. For many returning soldiers, the journey home was a shock on multiple levels. They had left a world of war, then lived in a world of fences and controlled routines. Now they were thrown into a chaotic civilian landscape, where nothing worked quite as before. Ration cards, destroyed infrastructure, missing relatives, and the heavy moral cloud of the Nazi past shaped everyday life. Hans returns to his village only to discover that his father has died in a bombing raid, his home is damaged, and his younger sister has been evacuated, and is living with relatives in another region. He carries with him only memories of battle, but also the strange experience of having been treated decently by the people he was told were barbarians. In countless German families, there were awkward conversations about what people had known, what they had believed, and what they had done. Former POWs compared notes. Those who had been in American or British hands often described conditions that, while far from luxurious, were relatively humane. Those who had been in harsher French, Yugoslav, or especially Soviet camps told very different stories of hunger, punishment, and fear. These returning prisoners played a key role in how post-war Germans understood the Allies and the New World Order. They had looked beyond propaganda, seen foreign countries up close, and often learned new languages and skills. They carried these experiences into factories, schools, political parties, and families. In the decades after the war, the story of German POWs in Allied hands became part of a larger struggle over memory. Different groups emphasized different aspects. Some former prisoners remembered kindness, fairness, and the chance to start again. Others focused on overcrowded camps, harsh guards, and the sense of collective punishment. In West Germany, narratives emerged that highlighted Allied failures, short rations in some early camps, legal grey zones, and the use of forced labor in France and elsewhere. At times, these stories were used to suggest a kind of moral equivalence between the crimes of the Nazis and the hardships suffered by German POWs. But any honest look at the historical record reveals a stark asymmetry. Western Allied camps, despite serious problems, did not operate as deliberate extermination systems. They did not systematically starve or murder prisoners as policy. They were imperfect, at times unjust, and shaped by the hunger and chaos of the immediate post-war years. But they were still bounded by a recognizable framework of law and restraint. By contrast, millions of prisoners in German hands, especially Soviet POWs, died of starvation, disease, abuse, and execution under a system that was intentionally brutal and often openly genocidal. This does not erase the suffering of German prisoners, but it does place their experience in a broader moral and historical context. In Germany, some ex-POWs became advocates for reconciliation. They wrote memoirs, spoke in schools, and worked with veterans groups on both sides to promote understanding. Others withdrew into silence, carrying their memories privately, unwilling or unable to revisit the past. In the United States, Britain, and France, the memory of German POWs faded faster. For many locals, the prisoners had been a brief, strange presence, men who worked the fields, repaired roads, or stood behind barbed wire on the edge of town. After repatriation, most camps were dismantled, their barracks torn down or repurposed. Today, in many places, only a small plaque or a line in a local history book reminds people that thousands of enemy soldiers once lived there. Yet the questions raised by their story remain deeply relevant. How should a democracy treat its defeated enemies? What does it mean to uphold laws and conventions when emotions demand revenge? And how far can humane treatment go before it collides with the memory of crimes that must never be forgotten? We return one last time to Hans Müller, now an old man. He stands at the edge of a quiet field near the Rhine, not far from where he first surrendered in 1945. The barbed wire is gone. The guard towers are gone, only the wind moves through the grass. 4 years, he rarely spoke about the war. Like many of his generation, he tried to build a normal life, work, family, a small house, routine. But as he grew older, he realized that silence was also a kind of burden. So he began to tell his grandchildren the story of how he once raised his hands in front of American soldiers and did not know if he would live to see another day. He tells them about the mud, the hunger, and the fear in those first makeshift camps. He tells them about the long journey across the ocean, the shock of seeing America, the long rows of wooden barracks, and the endless lines of corn and cotton under the summer sun. He tells them about the guard who shared cigarettes, the farmer's wife who handed him a cup of coffee, the American child who waved from a porch as the power truck passed. He does not romanticize captivity. He remembers the boredom, the fights, the humiliation of being reduced to a number. He remembers men who never came home, dying of illness or accidents far from their families. But he also remembers something else, the realization that his enemies had chosen not to treat him he had been taught they would. Looking back, Hans sees his time as a POW as a kind of bridge. On one side is the world he grew up in, a Germany of dictatorship, propaganda, and total war. On the other side is the world he returned to, a defeated nation forced to confront its crimes, rebuild its society, and rethink what it meant to be German. His experience in Allied camps did not solve everything. It did not erase the horrors of the war or the suffering caused by the regime he had served. But it gave him a living example of how power can be used, even over a defeated enemy, without completely abandoning humanity. As the camera slowly pulls back, we see Hans walking away from the former campsite, now just a peaceful field. Birds fly overhead, cars pass in the distance on a modern highway. The world has moved on, yet the choices made in those camps, by guards, by commanders, and by the prisoners themselves, continue to echo. The story of German POWs in Allied camps is not a simple tale of heroes and villains. It is a story of hunger and routine, of fear and decency, of law and improvisation. Most of all, it is a story about what happens after the shooting stops, when the victors must decide not only how to punish, but how to live with those they have defeated. As long as we wage wars, we will face these questions again and again. The men behind the wire in 1945 cannot answer them for us. But they can remind us that even in victory, the way we treat our enemies says as much about us as it does about them.